Thank you, Nuno. It's a pleasure to be here. So welcome everybody. Greetings from beautiful Davos in Switzerland. I've literally come off the mountain early just to be with you guys. So we're going to talk about the space economy and a little bit about space financing for just half an hour now. I know it's not a lot of time, so we're going to cram a lot of stuff into 30 minutes, but please bear with me. And thank you, Nuno, for the introduction you have made already. Okay, well, as I said, Nuno has done a fantastic job introducing myself. So I probably shouldn't add too much here. I'm Rafael Rotkin. I'm a dual German and Brazilian citizen. So since this is organized out of Portugal, boa tarde a todos que estamos assistindo in Portugal. And now I'm going to go back to English. You can see my previous life basically on the left here. I have about 20 years of financial markets experience in M&A and investing roles. And since a few years, I am 100% in the space sector, as Nuno mentioned, as an investor, primarily in early stage space companies through my VC firm, E2MC, which stands for Earth to Mars Capital. But I'm also involved in some other investing entities, like, for example, Space Ventures, a crowdfunding platform in the US. I'm involved in a few other things. I'm a mentor at a few space specialized accelerators like Creative Destruction Lab and Seraphim Space Camp. I'm a member of a Swiss organization that cares a lot about how space can be used for positive impact called Space for Impact. And my outreach roles as a podcast host and an author and as a writer and speaker, Nuno has already mentioned. Right, so let's jump into it, the space economy. So I guess the first question many people ask is, so space has been around for a long time, right? We launched the first artificial spacecraft above the Kármán line, which is generally the definition of space, 100 kilometers of altitude. I think in 1944, it was a German V2 rocket, actually a weapon of war, of course. And then we landed a man on the moon, well, a couple of men on the moon in 1969. So space has been around for a long time. Why is it interesting now as a business theme, an investing theme? And what I want to leave with you here, and many of you may already know this, one main reason, if not the main reason, is we're experiencing dramatic cost decreases in the cost of accessing and operating space. I put a 90% number here, and you will see where that comes from. And another point here is that SpaceX, and here on the left, of course, those are SpaceX Falcon 9 boosters, which are returning to Earth. They have obviously, SpaceX, by virtue of having reusable rockets, they've helped to bring down the cost of accessing space a lot, right? Because these boosters, which you're seeing here in the picture, each one of them costs probably around $30 million. Not throwing them away, but reusing them 7, 8, 9, 10 times. I think we just yesterday set a record for reusing one for the 9th time. That makes a huge difference, right? Because suddenly, you amortize the cost of the booster, not over one time, but over 9 times. And as a consequence of these developments, the space economy is now projected to grow to trillions of dollars. And again, we dive a little bit deeper into that. So let's do that. Right, so first, launch costs, which I've already started talking about. So what you have here on the left is a very traditional rocket. It's an Atlas V, which actually comes in many configurations. I believe the picture here is a so-called 552 configuration, but don't worry about the details. What I want you to take away is that the cost of that rocket is approximately $8,000 to take 1 kilogram of mass to what we call a low Earth orbit, or abbreviated LEO. And by the way, all of the numbers I'm giving you are sort of directional numbers. Reality is always more complicated, right? But take them as directionally right. In the middle, again, you have the Falcon 9, and especially what you see in the picture here is the Falcon 9 boosters coming back. Actually, 2 of the 3 boosters of the Falcon Heavy, actually, a heavy launch version of the Falcon 9 rocket. But the Falcon 9 rocket in its single booster version, the cost to get 1 kilogram up to low Earth orbit is not $8,000, but it's somewhere around below $3,000 if you buy the entire rocket. If you share the ride, with other people's satellites, it's currently advertised at $5,000 by SpaceX, so still a significant savings. What you see on the right, and many of you may be accompanying this, and it's very exciting, that's SpaceX's proposed next generation vehicle called the Starship system. And what I believe here is the picture is actually of the prototype 10, so-called SN10. And that's a fully reusable vehicle. And if that works, I mean, we don't know the exact numbers, but it may bring down the costs to hundreds of dollars and possibly even below $100. So the cost of accessing space in terms of getting 1 kilogram, for example, to low Earth orbits I've described, it might come down by another magnitude. So this is where you see when we go from $8,000 potentially to below $800, this is where I came up with the 90% plus number. Right, but I really want you to also take away from this that the launch cost is not the only thing that is dropping. actually all of the components of things that we're using in space, so entire satellite systems, or all of the subsystems and components of satellites, all of that has been dropping in costs as well. And it also has been getting smaller, and you will see this in the next couple of slides. What you have here on this slide actually is a picture of a 1970s spy satellite. And I mean, it's huge. Look at this. I mean, it's the size of a bus or something. And while it's not fully comparable, what you have on this slide, so again, it's the same spy satellite from the 70s on the top. On the bottom, you have the satellites of an Earth observation company called Planet. And while you cannot exactly compare the capability of the satellites, they're sort of similar. I mean, both basically have the function of observing the Earth, of taking optical pictures of the Earth. And look at the difference in size. And I can tell you the difference in cost. And well, the satellite on top, it cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Those satellites you see here on the bottom and you see on the right, there's just racks full of these satellites. I mean, here you can see they're very, very small, right? They're sort of like, maybe half a meter long. And they cost maybe $1 or $2 million, including the launch, not hundreds of millions of dollars. So, it's an improvement of 2 magnitudes in terms of cost. So again, it's not just the launch costs that are dropping, but also the cost of operating and components in space. Right. So what this enables, these dramatic cost decreases, is that many activities in space are now economically feasible, including many activities that previously were not economically feasible at all. People just said, like, no, this doesn't make any sense. It's too expensive. And I apologize, this is sort of a busy slide, but hopefully you can sort of take it in a little bit of the next couple of minutes. So those are the different activities which are going on, mostly around the Earth, and this is what's happening already and happening in the near term in terms of business models. And then, of course, the longer we move out in terms of the time frame, we hope to have more activity around the Moon again, and then ultimately around the Mars and maybe other celestial bodies like the asteroid belt and so forth. But if we start around the Earth, where most of the commercial activity is taking place right now, things like, of course, launching rockets or satellite communications or remote sensing, space tourism. We'll briefly talk about each of these in the following slides. And that's what we call the space economy. Now, just to give you a background also on the size of the space economy. And so the latest numbers we have are for 2019. This is from something called SIA, which is the Satellite Industry Association. They estimate the total size of the global space economy to be at $366 billion in global revenues. And this is dominated still by satellite television, which is an application many of us will know very well, right? It's when you have put your dish on the roof, on the balcony of your home, and you receive basically satellite television. It's been around for a while. It's very well established, and it's still the biggest part of this 366 billion. This is what is really prominent, right? The actual launching of rockets you see here on the bottom of the slide, that's not even 5 billion, right? So it might be much smaller than people think. But this is the current composition of the space economy. I should also be intellectually honest and state for completeness that there has been a report last year, I think it was a group led out of MIT, that said that there might be it's actually very likely there's some double counting going on here in the terms of, for example, that some of the government activities of government money that's going into space is counted twice. It's being counted as government activity in space and then counted as, let's say, for example, buying a satellite. So that the real size might be only something like $200 billion. Now, honestly, myself, I'm not too concerned about that. I believe we're still very early on in this new space economy, and whether it's 200 or 300 billion, it's just the base from which we're going to grow. And speaking of growing from the base, so there's some forecasts out there where the space economy might go in terms of size by some investment banks. Here on the left, UBS and Morgan Stanley. UBS at $1 billion and Morgan Stanley at slightly above it. $1 trillion, obviously, and UBS about $900 billion, so both roughly around $1 trillion, right, in the next, by 2040. And on the right, by ULA, which is a very well-established rocket company, launch services provider in the US, and they estimated maybe in 2045 he might get to almost $3 trillion. Now, look, honestly, nobody knows, right? I think this is a little bit akin to trying to estimate the size of the internet in like the mid-90s. Like everybody understands there is very dramatic technological change going on, and it will have a huge impact. Like in my experience, 20 years as an investor, you cannot have an industry where the costs go down more than a magnitude and it doesn't have a huge impact. It will make the industry grow. But whether these numbers are right, whether it's 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, I don't think anybody knows. But I think there's a very good argument that there will be very significant growth for the foreseeable future. Right. So now, as I promised, we're going to go very briefly through some of what I call the subsectors of the space economy. So one slide on each just, and again, we don't have a lot of time. We could speak for hours on each of these. So first, launch, or colloquially rocket companies, right? So some of the points I want you to take away here, and by the way, on the picture on the right is Astra. It's a startup that just announced a transaction to list on the stock exchange, and that's their Rocket 3. I think that might be 3.0, 3.2, which is being launched for the moment from Alaska. What I want you to take away for rocket companies, very high capital intensity. So many of the companies have invested hundreds of millions of dollars to develop rockets. They've taken many, many years to develop them. And it's a business where you charge, obviously, by the mission, right? So if somebody flies a satellite, he's going to pay you for the mission to use your rocket. It's already a very competitive field. I think a lot of people got inspired by watching SpaceX. And on paper, there's almost 200 rocket startups. Obviously, most of them are what we call PowerPoint companies. It's just a presentation, but there are some serious players like, for example, Astra on the right. Another subsector of the space economy is spacecraft and components. When I say spacecraft, that's sort of an overarching expression. Most of what that mostly encompasses are satellites, but spacecraft is the general expression, like a capsule that for astronauts, that's also a spacecraft, for example, a space station, that's a spacecraft. But most of it at the moment, of course, are satellites. And there's various ways you can make money with this, right? You can produce a certain component of a satellite, like the propulsion system or the solar array, or you could put the entire satellite together. It's what we call the integration of the satellite. And there's quite a few players who do this. There's established ones like the big players like Airbus in Europe or Lockheed Martin and Honeywell in the US. And there's some newer players as well, like, for example, Tyvek in the US or Nano Avionics in Europe. Satellite communications, right? So you have to use these satellites that we talked about in the previous slides for some business purpose, right? And so satellite communications, again, is a very well-known use case, probably the best-known use case by virtue of satellite TV, which we already mentioned. But there's some other use cases of satellite communications. One is providing broadband communications, internet, and so forth with the help of satellites. And the key example of that is SpaceX's, well, I was going to say proposed Starlink network, but it's now in existence, right? They have, I think, around 1,000 satellites already up there, and it's in beta test. So that's a reality. And Amazon is planning a similar thing with Project Kuiper, and there's some other companies like OneWeb and Telesat. Another type of satellite communications business is what we call Internet of Things connectivity. And that's very different from broadband. So broadband, again, that might involve, streaming videos or what we're doing here, video conferences. Internet of Things is when you connect some assets, like maybe containers or ships or wind turbines in remote locations, and you want to basically monitor them. You want to see, okay, is the wind turbine functioning? Where is the container, and so forth. So it's a much, much lower bandwidth application. Hence, the satellites can be smaller, and it has quite a few consequences. So it's a different type of business with different hardware, different satellite constellations, and quite a few players, probably around 20 or so, already playing in that. Everybody who is involved with satellite communications in space also needs what's called the ground segment, which is where you receive, well, A, you have to control the satellites, and B, you have to receive the data from the satellites. And there are some companies who are just doing that part. So they're technically not operating in space, but of course fully dependent in terms of their business model on other people operating in space. You also have the components business of satellite communications. So people, for example, who produce antennas to receive satellite data. And a few other business models. And the other thing I want you to take away here is similar to the rocket business. Whenever you're in a satellite communications business where you have to put hardware into space, like, for example, a satellite constellation, again, it can get very capital intensive very quickly, and it might take a little while until you actually see revenue because you have to deploy your constellation of satellites first. Another very prominent subsector of the space economy is remote sensing, or sometimes we call it Earth observation. Remote sensing is the more generalist term, right? Because we could observe something different than the Earth, right? We could observe the moon or Mars or some other celestial body. But it's basically you have a satellite and it observes, for example, the Earth with an optical camera or some other sensor. It could be an infrared sensor, or it could be radar, or it could be what we call a hyperspectral sensor. And this has different use cases. I mean, really, it's limited only by your imagination here and by what somebody is willing to pay for. What you see here on the right, those are a couple of satellite images from a very well-known company, remote sensing company called Planet, which I think was founded in 2010, and they're using mostly optical sensors to observe the entire Earth. On top here, you have an oil storage facility, and that's one use case, right? You could observe economic activity and sort of from these pictures tell, well, how much oil is in these storage facilities, which you can, for example, you can tell by the shadows of the tanks. On the lower picture, that's a different use case which has been around since the very beginning of the space economy. It's basically spy satellites. That's a picture of Pyongyang, right, in North Korea, which is probably satellites. That's the only way to observe Pyongyang in this way. It's for obvious reasons would be very problematic and probably dangerous to try to use drones or aircraft to take pictures like this. And there's a couple of ways you can operate a business in remote sensing / Earth observation. You can operate your own satellites, producing your own data. That's what we call upstream. Or what's also very common is you can just buy somebody else's satellites data and just analyze it in some value-added way. And that's what we call downstream. And then some people do both. And that's what we would call vertically integrated. Space tourism, very exciting, right? Because we can identify with that, and many of us want to go to space. There's a few different ways of doing that. One is going on a suborbital flight. That's as the name implies, you don't go into an orbit, you just go up and down. And prominent players doing that is mostly Virgin Galactic. And here on the upper left, you see their Spacecraft 2 spaceship, which would take 6 passengers. And on the very right, you see Blue Origin's New Shepard spacecraft. Different type of vehicle, has a capsule on top. I think, again, it takes, if I'm not mistaken, 6 passengers. You go up and down, you get about, both vehicles, about 5 minutes of microgravity. The price is about, for both vehicles, probably around $250,000, $300,000. Or much more exciting, of course, you could go to orbit and either stay in orbit in a capsule surrounding the Earth, or you could go to an International Space Station and stay there. It has historically already happened. We've had already 7 private space explorers. They don't like to be called space tourists. And I understand why, because they go through serious training. So they call themselves private space explorers. And that's now starting again. Later this year, we're supposed to have a private mission on a SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule. And that's organized by an American space company called Axiom, where we have a very small investment in my firm. And they're doing this. But Axiom also, in the medium term, and in a few years, they want to develop their own private space station. And that's the picture you see here on the lower left. If you know what the ISS, the existing International Space Station, looks like, it's a fantastic platform. But it's essentially a government laboratory, and it doesn't have any creature comforts, right? And it doesn't look very nice inside. You see on the lower left, that looks very nice. It's been entirely designed by Philippe Starck, the French designer. So it's a sort of a different experience for the private space explorers. One thing that's interesting about space tourism is that, myself, my firm, we foresee a significant supply-demand imbalance in the near term, at least in the next few years, because there's actually quite a few wealthy people who are interested in going to space. And there's some private banks, for example, have made surveys on that with their customers. On the other hand, there's very few vehicles that actually can get you into space. So hence the supply-demand imbalance. Another subsector is in-space experimentation and manufacturing. And there's a couple of, we should divide this into 2 categories. One is sort of producing things in space for use in space. So for example, you could sort of put together parts of a space station in space. You could 3D print some components or satellites. And that's what you see in the upper picture here, which is sort of a satellite platform that 3D prints beams along which it then deploys solar arrays. But another really interesting use case is manufacturing things in space for use on Earth. And they do this because the microgravity environment can help you produce some things, in a better way or in a way that's not even possible on Earth. And the examples of that are optical fiber, certain other types of materials, certain types of biological materials, including human tissues, which you can grow in 3 dimensions easily in space, which is not possible on Earth because of gravity. Again, we could talk a very long time about this, but this is something that's also starting to happen. And historically, it was way too expensive, but now suddenly it starts making increasingly sense. We have something called in-orbit services as another subsegment of the space economy. And this is basically, as the name implies, something that happens where both the supplier and customer are in orbit. Examples of that is what we call space tugs, which are providing basically connecting flights in space. So maybe a SpaceX rocket takes up your satellite to a certain place, but that's not the final destination. And to reach your final destination, another spacecraft comes along and basically takes your satellite to the final destination. It's sort of like, almost an Uber picking you up at the airport and taking you to your hotel. And that's one example of an in-orbit service. Other examples include the removal of space debris. So we have more and more debris up there because we send more and more satellites, up there. And that's what you see on the upper picture here. This is the spider-like thing is a spacecraft proposed by a Swiss company called ClearSpace, and it's basically here grabbing a defunct satellite and it would throw it back into the Earth atmosphere to evaporate and basically get rid of this debris. And there's other in orbit services use cases, like, for example, refueling satellites or data storage and a few other things. Now, many of these are dependent on the space economy developing in the first place. So in some way, many of them are the derivative, right? So you have to be a bit careful and you have to really have faith that the space economy does develop. So these derivative business models then can work. And then there's so many other things, and I just call it the kitchen sink. There's global navigation satellites, which all of us know because we use GPS. There's people who plan your entire space mission for you. Find a rocket, find a satellite, schedule the launch. It's called mission as a service. You need spaceports to launch rockets, right? Most of them are government owned, but there's now some private companies building spaceports. There's some people talking about in-space power generation. The idea has been around for a while. Again, it's always been too expensive. Now it increasingly may make sense. There's all of the things that are happening around the moon and are going to happen around the moon in the next few years. There's space entertainment. Yes, that will be a thing. And again, there's sort of your imagination is the limit here. And I'm sure sort of creative entrepreneurs are going to come up with many things, how we can use these much cheaper costs to provide some business in space. And that's really the point of this slide. So I often compare the space economy to where the internet was in the mid-90s, that we have these dramatic technological changes and trends. Again, the most important one being the cost decrease in accessing and operating in space. But we're only just scratching the surface in terms of the use cases. Like back in the mid-90s in the internet, people knew that there was email, people knew there was some basic web browsing, Amazon just started selling books, but nobody I knew was imagining, Uber or Airbnb or Facebook, and I have every faith that creative entrepreneurs will come up with exciting business models in space using the much cheaper cost. And they'll be very exciting to see. And of course, self-servingly speaking, for people like me, that will be very exciting to invest in as well. Okay, couple of slides really quickly on investing in space on that note. So how can you invest in space if you think that all of these things I've told you so far are very exciting? Well, if you divide in sort of private investments and the public markets investments, private investments, you can obviously invest directly in space startups, right, as an angel investor. You can invest sometimes through what's called special purpose vehicles, right, where several investors team up and then invest in a space company. Or, of course, you can invest indirectly through venture funds like E2MC, my own fund, or there's some other space specialized funds out there. Or now you can increasingly invest also in space via the public markets, i.e. on the stock exchange. So there's more and more space companies being listed. And that's substantially thanks to the current trend of the SPACs, the special purpose acquisition companies, which I'll come back to in a minute. And we also have already 1 or 2 space ETFs, exchange traded funds. And another one has been proposed and filed for in January this year by ARK Investment Management, very well-known US investment manager focused on next generation technologies. I want you to keep in mind there's some specific challenges for investing in space, and you may be familiar with them already. It's a deep tech industry, so I want people to respect that, right? For example, if you want to go and invest directly in a space company, make sure you know what you're doing, right? It's because, make sure you're able to actually do the due diligence on the company. It's a lot of space is very much deep tech. As I've already mentioned a couple of times, at least parts of the space industry can be very capital intensive, and it can take a while to get to revenues, just something to keep in mind. And that's good and bad, right? It also provides a barrier once you have something up there. And at least until recently, we had a scarcity of successful exits, so via listing or sales of space companies. Now, partly again because of the SPACs, that's now improving, but there's also like an increasing number of acquisitions of space companies. But I'm not concerned about it, to be honest, because again, I think we're very early on in this latest cycle of the space economy, and it's actually quite normal that we haven't seen a lot of exits yet. I mean, how many internet exits were there in like 96 or 97, right? It was too early. And actually, the other thing that typically happens is that you see the failures first, and then the successes, because building a successful company often takes 10 years. So I'm personally not worried about exits, but I respect, of course, that some investors are worried about it. But I have every faith that this is now improving. And as a consequence of all of this, over the last few years, we've had more and more private money flowing into space. So here you see basically these bars tell you the number and the total amount of money flowing into space venture investing. And different people track this in different ways, and different people have different definitions of what is a space company. Our internal definition, like last year, for example, despite COVID, we were over $5 billion of this type of private investment in space companies. And here are some examples. And you see some of these fundraising rounds. I mean, they happen across the world. You see some US companies, you see a few Chinese companies here as well, very important space market. And almost all of these fundraising rounds here are over $100 million. So again, you can see the capital intensity, especially if it's something like a launch company, and there's several launch companies here. And you also see all of or various of the subsectors I've talked to you about represented here in these examples from 2020. And the year 2021, I don't have on here, but it already started out very well as well in terms of this private space investing. Now, I was talking about the SPACs, the special purpose acquisition companies. And just very briefly for those who may not know, this is basically, a SPAC is something that you list on the stock exchange that basically it's taking in the money, often it could be like $200-300 million, and holds this cash in trust, and it's promising to investors that, look, we are qualified people for one reason or another, and we're going to find some interesting company, operating company, to merge with that can benefit from the cash we have in trust. And this is going on across industries. For example, there's been quite a few examples in the EV and the electric vehicle industry as well. But we've had a few examples recently in the space industry. So for example, we had Virgin Galactic, the space tourism company, which did a SPAC merger in late 2019. But then just in the last few months, since October 2020, we've had another 6 announcements, not executed, but just announcements of SPAC mergers of space companies, and which are listed here. Across subsectors, the SPACs are all in the US. It's very much a US phenomenon right now. But all of these companies now, if these deals actually get executed, the space companies will suddenly get access to a few $100 million. And that's very significant, right? I mean, it's sort of like they're accelerating their fundraising, probably in the private markets. If they had gone through the private market round of raising a Series B, Series C venture investment, it may have taken them a certain time. And suddenly now they can accelerate their business models. So you have to see how this all plays out. But in theory, if taking an optimistic view, this could be very positive because it accelerates capital deployment into the space economy. What I will tell you, I compare it basically, it's almost like a rocket motor, and the pun is totally intended here. If you get the right type of rocket motor that's built by people that know what they're doing in building the rocket motor, i.e. the SPAC company, and the people who use the rocket motor, i.e. the space company, they also know what they're doing, then you can get to the moon, i.e. fulfilling your business plan, much, much faster. If you don't know what you're doing, you might get, pun intended, a big explosion. But again, for the moment, I remain very optimistic. And when you have a qualified SPAC team that know what they're doing, that understands space, and you have a good space company that can deploy these hundreds of millions of dollars, then it can be an incredible thing. And this is something put together internally. We created a proprietary index of space companies at E2MC, which is the red line. And you can see here, in like late 2020, it started outperforming a lot. It just recently come down a little bit in a correction, which is probably very healthy, but it had outperformed even the NASDAQ. And there's a lot more detail behind this where unfortunately we can't go into detail. If you want to learn more about space, just quickly, I mentioned I have my podcast, which you have on every major platform, where typically I interview new space entrepreneurs. Nuno mentioned I'd written a book here on the left. Unfortunately, it's only available in German for now, although this year probably will translate at least to French and maybe also to some other language. I also recommend the book of my friend Rob Jacobson, which is available in English on the right. I have a entrepreneurship course as a MOOC on Udemy. As Nuno mentioned, I teach at a couple of universities, but of course that's not accessible to people outside the universities. This course is accessible. And this. I don't know whether we're doing Q&A here, but you can also find out more about myself and my activities, on my company's website, e2mc.space. And then if you want to get links to, for example, the podcast, the book, the course, and other activities, some previous speeches that I've given, then you can go to my personal website, rafaelrodkin.com, and you can find everything there. So thank you very much. And Nuno, back to you.